Some dogs don't just hear the world, they hear what's about to happen next. The first time Shadow barked that way, Ethan Cole almost ignored it, the same way he had learned to ignore most things that didn't make sense anymore. It was late, somewhere past 10 p.m., and the air carried that dry mountain chill that slipped through denim and settled into your bones, the kind of cold that made the silence feel heavier than usual. And Ethan sat in the driver's seat of his old Ford pickup parked just outside a weathered cabin he'd been fixing for cash, the engine off, the ticking metal cooling beneath him, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel as if he hadn't quite decided whether to stay or leave. Shadow stood a few feet away near the edge of the dirt road, his dark coat blending into the shadows, ears high, body still, staring into the tree line like there was something out there worth listening to, something deeper than wind moving through branches. Then came the sound, 3 sharp barks, evenly spaced, not frantic, not aggressive, but deliberate, like a signal, and Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw, the rough stubble catching against his palm. "Easy, boy," he muttered, though the words carried more habit than conviction, because he had only known the dog for 3 days, and in those 3 days, he had already learned that Shadow didn't bark without reason. 3 days earlier, Ethan hadn't been looking for anything, not a job, not a place to stay, and definitely not a dog. He had been driving south on Route 89, the road stretching long and empty for miles, the kind of highway where the sky felt too big and the past had too much room to catch up with you. When he saw it, a shape near the shoulder, barely moving, something dark against the pale gravel, and most drivers would have passed it without a second glance. Just another stray, another piece of something left behind. But Ethan slowed, not because he planned to stop, but because something about the stillness didn't sit right. And by the time he realized it, his foot had already eased onto the brake, tires crunching as he pulled over. The dog didn't run, didn't even lift its head at first, just lay there, ribs faintly visible beneath a coat dulled by dust and time, eyes half open but alert in a quiet, guarded way, as if it had already decided the world wasn't worth the effort of reacting to anymore. Ethan stepped out, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, the wind carrying the faint scent of asphalt and dry grass. And he stood there for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets, looking down at the animal, unsure why he hadn't driven on like everyone else. "You're a long way from anywhere, aren't you?" he said under his breath, and the dog's ears flicked slightly, just enough to show it had heard him, just enough to make leaving feel like something heavier than it should have been. He crouched, slow and careful, not wanting to startle it, and for a second, their eyes met, not in a dramatic way, not like something out of a story, but quiet, steady, like two things that had both seen enough to recognize the same kind of emptiness in each other. And without thinking too much about it, Ethan reached out, his hand hovering just above the dog's neck before finally resting there, feeling the warmth beneath the coarse fur, the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that hadn't given up yet. "All right," he said softly, more to himself than the dog. "Let's get you out of here." And that was how it started, not with a plan, not with some grand intention, just a man who had stopped for something he couldn't explain, and a dog that didn't walk away. Now, 3 nights later, standing under a sky full of silent stars, that same dog was staring into the darkness again, body tense, listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. And when the second set of 3 barks broke through the stillness, something shifted, not in the air, not in the trees, but inside Ethan himself, a quiet instinct he hadn't trusted in years, the kind that used to keep him alive when nothing else could. And for the first time since he picked the dog up off that empty stretch of highway, he felt it. Clearly, this wasn't just a stray he had rescued, and whatever Shadow was hearing out there in the dark, it wasn't over yet. The wind did not change, but something about the silence did, like a breath held too long. Beneath the surface, and Ethan felt it as he stepped out of the truck, boots pressing into the packed dirt with a slow, deliberate weight, his eyes scanning the tree line where Shadow stood frozen, every line of the dog's body drawn tight with focus. The cabin behind him creaked softly as the temperature dropped, wood settling into the cold, and somewhere in the distance a faint metallic echo drifted through the air, so subtle it could have been mistaken for memory. But Shadow did not mistake it, his ears flicking forward again before he let out another low, restrained bark, not loud this time, just enough to say that whatever was out there had not moved on. Ethan pulled his jacket closer, the flannel lining worn thin at the elbows, and took a few steps toward the edge of the clearing. "You hear something, boy?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the answer, because Shadow had not taken his eyes off that same point since the first bark, and there was a steadiness in that gaze that Ethan recognized from another life, one where hesitation could cost more than pride. He crouched slightly, watching the dog's posture, the way his weight shifted forward, not in fear, but in readiness, and for a moment, the years seemed to fold in on themselves, bringing back a version of Ethan who trusted instincts more than explanations, a version he had buried somewhere along the miles he had traveled alone. The sound came again, clearer this time, a faint creak followed by a soft, uneven thud, like something settling where it should not have been, and Ethan's eyes moved past Shadow, deeper into the trees where the darkness thickened between the trunks, and he realized the noise was not random. It had a pattern, irregular but repeating, the kind of sound that did not belong to wind or wildlife. Shadow stepped forward, just one pace, then stopped, turning his head briefly toward Ethan as if asking permission, his amber eyes catching what little light remained from the sky, and Ethan nodded once without thinking. "All right, slow," he murmured, his voice low and steady, and together they moved toward the tree-line, the ground shifting from hard dirt to a softer layer of fallen needles that muted their steps. The air changed as they entered the woods, cooler, heavier, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and something metallic underneath, and Ethan felt his chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet awareness that something was not where it should be. A few yards in, Shadow stopped again, his body angled toward a shallow dip in the ground, barely visible unless you were looking for it, and he let out a short, sharp bark, once, then twice, then a third time, the same pattern, always three, and Ethan stepped closer, his boots brushing aside loose debris until the shape beneath became clearer, a section of ground that looked disturbed, as if it had shifted recently, not collapsed, but unsettled, and when he leaned down, pressing his hand lightly against the surface, he felt it, a faint vibration, subtle but steady, like a distant pulse traveling through the earth. He froze for a second, the sensation sending a quiet ripple through his memory. Not a full image, just a feeling, something he had learned to recognize long ago, and he exhaled slowly, pulling his hand back. "That is not normal," he said under his breath, more to himself than the dog, and Shadow responded with a low, almost questioning sound, his tail still, his posture unchanged. Ethan straightened, glancing back toward the cabin, then back to the ground, weighing something he could not fully explain, because part of him wanted to walk away, to leave whatever this was, buried and forgotten, but another part, the part that had stopped on that empty highway 3 days ago, refused to ignore it. And as the vibration came again, faint but undeniable, Ethan felt that same quiet shift inside him, the one that said this moment mattered, even if he did not yet understand why. And beside him, Shadow did not move, did not look away, as if he had been waiting for this exact place, this exact sound all along. The vibration did not stop when Ethan pulled his hand away. It lingered in the air like a memory that refused to fade, and for a moment he simply stood there, listening not just with his ears, but with something deeper, something he had not trusted in years, while Shadow remained fixed beside him, his body angled toward the disturbed ground as if guarding it, as if whatever lay beneath deserved both caution and attention. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual rustle of night reduced to a faint whisper through the branches, and Ethan lowered himself again, slower this time, brushing aside a thin layer of pine needles until his fingers met something firmer beneath, not stone, not roots, but wood, old and weathered, hidden just below the surface. He paused, studying it, the edges too straight to be natural, the grain faintly visible even in the dim light, and he felt a quiet realization settle in. This was not just earth shifting. This was something placed here, something built and then forgotten, or maybe left behind on purpose. "Well, that is something," he murmured, his voice barely more than breath, and Shadow responded with a soft huff, stepping closer but not crossing the invisible line around the spot, his instincts keeping him just far enough to observe without interfering. Ethan pressed down lightly on the wood, testing it, and it gave slightly under the weight, not collapsing, but loose, as if whatever held it in place had weakened over time. And when the faint vibration pulsed again, he felt it more clearly now, not random, not chaotic, but measured, almost like a signal trying to be heard through layers of soil and silence. He sat back on his heels, exhaling slowly as his eyes traced the outline. Beneath the ground, forming the shape in his mind, a hatch, or maybe a door, something that led somewhere below, and the thought should have unsettled him more than it did, but instead it stirred a familiar focus, the kind that used to come before decisions that mattered, the kind that did not allow room for doubt. Shadow shifted again, his ears flicking toward the cabin behind them for a brief second before snapping back to the ground, as if aware of two things at once, what was here and what might follow, and Ethan noticed it, the way the dog balanced his attention, not restless, but alert in a way that suggested understanding beyond instinct. "You knew this was here, did you not?" Ethan said quietly, not expecting an answer, but Shadow's tail gave a single, slow movement, not quite a wag, more like acknowledgement, and for a second, the idea did not feel as strange as it should have. The air grew colder as the minutes passed, the kind of chill that crept through layers and settled into muscle, and Ethan stood, brushing the dirt from his hands, his gaze moving once more between the hidden wood and the path back to the cabin, weighing the choice in front of him, because whatever this was, it was not urgent in the way danger usually announced itself, but it carried a different kind of weight, quiet, persistent, like something waiting to be noticed by the right person at the right time. He took a step back, then another, not retreating, just creating space to think, and Shadow followed, matching his movement exactly, never turning his back on the spot. And as they reached the edge of the trees, Ethan glanced over his shoulder one last time, committing the place to memory, the angle of the trunks, the slope of the ground, the way the moonlight barely touched the disturbed earth. "We will come back to this," he said, the words steady, certain, and Shadow finally relaxed just enough to lower his head slightly, the tension easing from his frame, as if the decision itself had resolved something unseen. They walked back toward the cabin in silence, the faint vibration fading with distance but not disappearing entirely. And as Ethan stepped onto the wooden porch, the boards creaking softly beneath his weight, he realized that the night had shifted in a way he could not undo. Because 3 days ago, he had stopped for a dog without knowing why, and now that same dog had led him to something buried beneath the earth, something that did not belong to chance alone. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the years of distance and doubt, a quiet thought surfaced, not loud enough to be called belief, but strong enough to stay. Some things do not ask to be understood. They simply wait to be followed. Sleep did not come easy that night, not because of the cold or the unfamiliar creaks of the cabin settling into the dark, but because something beneath the surface of the world had made itself known. And once a man noticed something like that, it was difficult to pretend it did not exist. Ethan lay on the narrow bed with one arm resting over his chest, staring at the ceiling where faint shadows moved with the shifting light of the moon, while Shadow remained near the door, not curled up as most dogs would be, but seated, alert, his ears tilting at sounds too subtle for human hearing, and every so often, he would lift his head slightly, as if checking that Ethan was still there. The quiet between them felt different now, not empty, but shared, like a space both understood without needing to explain. Sometime after midnight, Ethan sat up, the restlessness settling too deep to ignore, and he swung his legs over the side of the bed, boots finding the floor without a sound, his movements instinctive, measured, the way they used to be when stillness mattered more than speed. And Shadow stood immediately, not startled, just ready, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment. "Could not sleep either, huh?" Ethan said softly, reaching for his jacket, and the dog stepped closer, tail low but steady, his gaze fixed not on Ethan this time, but toward the direction of the trees beyond the cabin walls. Outside, the air had grown sharper, the kind of cold that carried clarity with it. And as Ethan stepped onto the porch, he paused for a moment, letting the silence settle around him, listening for that faint vibration again. But from here, there was nothing, Just the distant hum of wind brushing over the ridge and the soft rustle of dry leaves shifting under their own weight. Still, the absence of the sound did not ease the feeling it had left behind, and Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath drifting into the night like a thin veil. Shadow moved ahead of him this time, not rushing, not pulling, just walking with purpose, glancing back once to make sure Ethan followed. And together they crossed the clearing again, the ground familiar now, each step guided more by memory than sight. When they reached the edge of the trees, Shadow stopped, his body tightening once more, the same silent alertness returning as if they had never left, and Ethan felt it too. This time, not as a vibration under his hand, but as a presence in the air, subtle, almost intangible, like standing near something that carried its own quiet rhythm. He stepped closer to the spot they had uncovered earlier, crouching down without hesitation, brushing aside the thin layer of debris they had disturbed before, and the wood beneath felt colder now, as if the night itself had settled into it. He pressed his palm against it again, and there it was, faint but steady, the same measured pulse. And this time, he did not pull away. "All right," he whispered, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "Let us see what you are." And with careful hands, he began clearing more of the surface, pushing aside dirt and pine needles until the edges became clearer, revealing a rectangular outline, roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, just large enough to suggest purpose, not natural formation. Shadow circled once, then stopped at Ethan's side, lowering his head slightly, his nose hovering inches above the wood, not touching it, as if respecting something unseen. And when the vibration pulsed again, the dog let out a low, quiet sound, not fear, not warning, but something closer to recognition. Ethan worked slowly, methodically, uncovering what time had hidden, his fingers tracing along the edge until they found a narrow gap, a seam where the wood met something beneath, and when he pressed gently against it, the surface shifted just enough to confirm what he already knew. This was a door, and whatever lay below had been waiting longer than either of them could measure. He sat back on his heels, his breath steady, his mind clear in a way it had not been in years, because some part of him understood that this was not an accident, not a random discovery on a quiet night, but something placed in his path with intention, whether by chance or something beyond it. And as he looked at Shadow, who met his gaze without hesitation, there was no question left in him about turning back. The night remained silent, the forest still, but beneath the surface, something continued its quiet, patient rhythm, and Ethan knew that whatever waited below was not going anywhere. It had already begun, and now, so had he. The moment Ethan decided to open it, the world seemed to narrow to just 2 things, the steady rhythm beneath the wood and the quiet presence of the dog beside him. And everything else, the cold, the trees, the years he had spent drifting without direction, faded into the background like distant noise. He shifted his position, planting one knee firmly into the ground as he slid his fingers into the narrow seam along the edge of the wooden hatch, testing its weight, and for a second, it resisted. Not locked, but reluctant, like something that had not been touched in a long time. He exhaled slowly, tightening his grip, and applied steady pressure, not forceful, just patient, and gradually, the wood gave way with a low, muted creak, the sound barely louder than the wind brushing through the branches above. Shadow stepped back half a pace, not out of fear, but instinct, giving space as the edge of the hatch lifted just enough to break the seal it had held with the earth, and as it opened, a faint breath of air rose from below, cool and still, carrying a subtle scent of stone and something older, something that had remained undisturbed for years. Ethan paused, holding the hatch partially open, listening, not for movement, but for anything that might tell him whether he was alone in this discovery. But there was nothing, only that same quiet, measured pulse, now slightly clearer, echoing up from whatever lay beneath. He lifted the hatch further, revealing a dark opening about 3 feet across, just large enough for a man to pass through if he moved carefully. And at first, it looked like nothing more than a shadow cut into the earth, but as his eyes adjusted, he could make out the faint outline of a narrow set of steps leading down, carved or built long ago, their edges softened by time but still intact. "Well," he said under his breath, the word carrying both caution and something close to curiosity. Someone wanted this to be found eventually, and Shadow responded with a low, steady breath, his eyes fixed on the opening, not darting, not uncertain, just focused, as if this was the place he had been trying to lead Ethan toward all along. The air around the opening felt different, not colder, but heavier, like stepping into a space where sound behaved differently, where even a small movement seemed to carry more weight, and Ethan reached into his jacket, pulling out a small flashlight he kept for late repairs, clicking it on with a soft snap that broke the stillness just enough to remind him how quiet everything else had been. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the first few steps clearly, then fading into shadow. Further down, the light catching on rough surfaces and faint lines that suggested this was not a natural formation, but something built with intention, something meant to last. Shadow moved closer again, lowering his head slightly as he peered into the opening, his ears tilting forward, and for the first time since Ethan had known him, the dog let out a soft whine, not of fear, but of recognition. The kind of sound that came from understanding something that could not be explained. Ethan glanced at him, then back into the darkness, weighing the moment, because stepping down meant leaving the open night behind, leaving the certainty of sky and ground for something enclosed, something unknown, but turning away no longer felt like an option, not after everything that had led them here. He adjusted his footing, placing one hand on the edge of the hatch for balance, the other holding the flashlight steady, and he lowered his boot onto the first step, testing it carefully, feeling the solid resistance beneath him, and when it held, he shifted his weight forward, descending slowly, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. Shadow did not hesitate, following close behind, his presence a steady anchor in the narrowing space. And as Ethan moved deeper, the light from above began to fade, replaced by the focused beam of the flashlight and the quiet rhythm that seemed to grow clearer with each step, not louder, but closer, as if whatever had been calling out through the earth had finally found someone willing to listen. And in that moment, Ethan realized that this was no longer about a stray dog he had picked up on an empty road, and not just about a hidden door in the woods. This was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting, patiently, for the exact moment when he would be ready to follow it into the dark. The air grew cooler with each step, not the sharp cold of the open night, but a deeper, steadier chill that seemed to rise from the earth itself, wrapping around Ethan as he descended, the beam of his flashlight narrowing the world to a small circle of pale light, while everything beyond it remained patient and unseen. The wooden steps gave way to packed earth after about 8 feet, and then to something firmer, a surface that felt almost like stone beneath his boots, worn smooth in places as if it had once been walked on regularly, though not recently, not for a long time. Behind him, Shadow moved in silence, his nails barely making a sound, his breathing steady and controlled, and every few steps, Ethan could feel the dog pause for a fraction of a second, listening, measuring something in the quiet that Ethan could only sense in fragments. The opening above them had shrunk to a faint square of darkness edged with starlight, and when Ethan finally reached the bottom, he turned slightly, sweeping the light across the space around him, revealing a narrow corridor that stretched forward about 15 feet before widening into a small chamber. The walls were rough but deliberate, not natural cave, but carved or reinforced, the kind of work done with purpose rather than haste, and as the light moved, it caught on something metallic embedded along the side, a thin pipe or conduit running parallel to the floor, faintly humming with that same subtle rhythm he had felt above. Ethan stepped closer, crouching slightly, and held the beam steady, watching the pipe as if expecting it to explain itself, and when the vibration pulsed again, he saw it, a barely visible tremor along the surface, like a quiet signal traveling through it. "You hear that too," he said softly, though the words were unnecessary, because Shadow had already moved past him, positioning himself near the entrance of the wider chamber, his posture alert but not tense, his head tilted slightly as if he were trying to place a memory that did not fully belong to him. Ethan rose and followed, each step measured, the beam of light sliding across the floor and up the walls until it settled into the open space ahead. And there, in the center of the chamber, sat something unexpected, a simple wooden crate, about 3 feet wide, reinforced with metal bands that had dulled with age but remained intact. It was not ornate, not decorative, just practical. The kind of object meant to hold something of value without drawing attention to itself. And yet the moment Ethan saw it, he felt the weight of its presence, not because of what it was, but because of where it had been placed, hidden beneath layers of earth and time. Waiting, Shadow approached it slowly, circling once before stopping at the front, his nose hovering just inches from the surface. And then, for the first time since they had entered the underground space, he lowered himself into a seated position, not out of fatigue, but in a quiet, deliberate way, as if acknowledging that they had reached something important. Ethan stepped beside him, the flashlight beam steady now, and knelt down, studying the crate, his fingers tracing along the edge where the lid met the frame. Noticing the faint marks left by tools long ago, the subtle imperfections that spoke of human hands rather than machines, the hum beneath the floor continued, steady and unchanged, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if whatever powered that rhythm had anything to do with what lay inside the crate, or if the connection existed only in the timing of their discovery. He hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for the moment, because opening it would change something, not just in the space around him, but in the path that had brought him here. Shadow lifted his gaze then, meeting Ethan's eyes with a calm certainty that needed no interpretation, and in that look, there was no doubt, no question about whether they should continue, only a quiet understanding that they already had. Ethan exhaled, slowly, setting the flashlight down on the ground so the beam angled upward, casting long, steady shadows across the chamber, and with both hands, he reached for the lid of the crate, the wood cool beneath his fingers, the edges worn but solid, and as he prepared to lift it, the faint vibration beneath the earth pulsed once more, steady as a heartbeat, as if whatever had been waiting down here had finally found its moment to be seen. The wood resisted at first, not with force, but with the quiet weight of something that had not been moved in years, and Ethan felt it through his hands as he adjusted his grip along the edges of the crate lid, his fingers pressing into the worn grain as he lifted slowly, carefully, the hinges giving way with a soft, drawn-out creak that echoed gently through the chamber. Shadow did not move, his body still and composed, his eyes fixed on the opening as the lid rose inch by inch, and when the interior finally came into view, Ethan paused, holding it halfway open as if giving the moment space to settle. Inside, there was no gold, no machinery, nothing that demanded attention at first glance, just a collection of simple items arranged with a kind of quiet intention, a folded canvas cloth, a small metal case about the size of a book, and beneath it, a worn leather journal whose edges had softened with time. The flashlight beam shifted slightly as Ethan leaned closer, its light catching on the metal case, revealing faint scratches along its surface and a latch that had long since dulled to a muted gray. The hum beneath the floor continued, steady and unchanged, and for a moment, Ethan simply looked, not reaching in yet, as if understanding that whatever this was, it was not meant to overwhelm, but to be discovered piece by piece. Shadow lowered his head slightly, his ears relaxed now, not alert in the same way as before, but attentive, as if the urgency that had guided them here had eased into something calmer, something resolved. Ethan finally set the lid fully open and rested it against the back edge, freeing both hands, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached inside and lifted the metal case first, its weight solid but not heavy, the kind of weight that suggested purpose rather than value. He turned it over in his hands, examining the latch, and after a brief hesitation, he pressed it open, the small click sounding louder than it should have. In the stillness of the chamber, inside, nestled in a fitted interior, lay a compact device, no larger than a handheld radio, its surface lined with small indicators and a single narrow display, dark now, but faintly reflective under the beam of light. A thin cable extended from one side, leading back toward the conduit embedded in the wall, and as Ethan followed it with his eyes, he realized the connection. Whatever this system was, it was still active, still sending that steady pulse through the earth above. He set the case aside gently and picked up the journal next, the leather cool and slightly cracked beneath his fingers, and when he opened it, the pages revealed neat, careful handwriting, each line steady, deliberate, as if written by someone who understood the importance of clarity. He scanned the first page, the words forming slowly in his mind as he read them in silence. And though there was no urgency in the language, there was something unmistakable in the tone, a sense of preparation, of someone leaving behind not just information, but intention. Shadow shifted slightly beside him, letting out a soft breath as if acknowledging something unseen, and Ethan glanced at him briefly before returning his attention to the page, his focus narrowing, the outside world fading even further away. The deeper he read, the clearer it became that this was not an accident, not a forgotten storage space or a random construction. This place had been built, maintained, and left for a reason, one that had not yet fully revealed itself, but was beginning to take shape in the quiet space between the lines. He closed the journal halfway, resting his hand on its cover, and looked around the chamber again, seeing it differently now, not just as a hidden room beneath the earth, but as part of something larger, something that had been waiting not for just anyone, but for someone who would listen, who would follow, who would open the door when the time came. And as the steady pulse continued beneath his feet, unchanged and patient, Ethan felt a shift inside him, subtle but certain, the kind that did not ask for permission, only presence, because whatever he had stepped into down here, it was no longer just a discovery, it was a beginning. The words in the journal did not rush. They unfolded with a steady patience that mirrored the quiet pulse beneath the floor. And as Ethan turned the next page, the handwriting remained consistent, precise, each sentence carrying the weight of someone who had taken time to choose exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. It spoke of signals beneath the earth, of patterns that repeated over years, sometimes fading, sometimes returning stronger, and of a belief that these rhythms were not random, but part of something that could be observed, measured, and perhaps even understood by those willing to pay attention. Ethan read slowly, his eyes moving line by line, absorbing not just the information, but the tone behind it, the sense that whoever had written this had not been afraid, only careful, as if they had discovered something unexpected and decided to stay with it long enough to learn its language. Shadow shifted beside him again, this time letting out a soft, steady breath that seemed to match the rhythm coming from the conduit in the wall, and Ethan noticed it immediately, the way the dog's chest rose and fell in quiet alignment, not forced, not trained, but natural, as if he recognized the pattern in a way that went beyond thought. Ethan glanced from the journal to the device in the metal case, then to the thin cable connecting it to the wall, and for the first time, the pieces began to settle into something clearer. This was not just a hidden room, it was a listening place, a station designed to detect something beneath the surface, something that continued to move or pulse even now. He reached for the device again, lifting it carefully, and as his thumb brushed against its side, the screen flickered faintly to life, not fully illuminated, but enough to reveal a dim series of numbers and lines that shifted slowly, responding to the same rhythm he had been feeling all along. He held it steady, watching the pattern, and though he did not yet understand its meaning, he could see the consistency, the intervals between each movement, the subtle rise and fall that suggested this was not decay or malfunction, but function, something still working exactly as it was meant to. The journal lay open in his other hand, and as he turned another page, he found a section marked differently, the handwriting slightly heavier, as if written with more intention, and beneath it, a single line stood out, simple, direct, almost like a message left for whoever came after. Not everything hidden is meant to be taken. Some things are meant to be protected until the right moment arrives. Ethan read the sentence twice, letting it settle, and as he did, he became aware of something else, not in the words, not in the device, but in the quiet shift of Shadow's posture beside him. The dog had moved closer to the edge of the chamber, his body angled toward the steps they had come down, his ears lifted again, not tense, but attentive in a new way. Ethan followed his gaze, the flashlight beam catching the lower part of the corridor, and for a moment, there was nothing unusual, just the same narrow passage leading upward into darkness. But then he heard it, faint at first, almost lost beneath the steady pulse, a soft, distant sound from above, not wind, not wood settling, but something lighter, irregular, like movement brushing against the surface of the ground. He stood slowly, the device still in his hand, the journal resting against his leg, and his attention shifted fully now, from what had been discovered to what might be changing, because the space no longer felt as still as it had before. Shadow let out a low, quiet sound, not alarm, but awareness, and took a single step toward the corridor, then stopped, waiting, always waiting, as if understanding that whatever came next would not be met alone. Ethan took a breath, steady and controlled, his mind clearing the way it used to when decisions needed to be made without hesitation. And as he looked once more at the open crate, the journal, the device still quietly alive in his hand, he realized that whatever this place had been built to observe, it was not the only thing in motion anymore. And somewhere above them, beyond the hatch and the silent trees, the night itself had begun to shift. The sound above did not grow louder, but it became clearer, like something brushing gently across the surface of the world, just enough to disturb the silence without breaking it. And Ethan felt it settle into his awareness with a quiet certainty that this moment mattered, not because it was dangerous, but because it was connected to everything that had led them here. He moved toward the corridor slowly, the device still in his hand, its faint display pulsing in steady rhythm, while the journal rested under his arm, and Shadow stepped ahead of him without hesitation, his posture calm but focused, ears angled toward the opening above, as if tracking something beyond sight. Each step upward felt different now, not uncertain, but purposeful, the narrow passage guiding them back toward the hatch with a sense of return rather than retreat. And as they climbed, the air shifted again, carrying the faint scent of pine and cold earth, grounding them in the world above even as the rhythm below continued its quiet presence. When Ethan reached the top, he paused just beneath the opening, listening, the night beyond still and open, but no longer empty in the way it had been before, and Shadow stopped just below him, looking up, waiting, always waiting for that final cue. Ethan pushed the hatch open fully, the wood moving easier now as if it had already accepted its purpose, and the cool night air flowed down around him, clean and familiar, carrying with it the soft whisper of wind through the trees. He stepped out onto the forest floor, boots pressing into the same disturbed patch of earth they had uncovered earlier. But now it felt different, not just a place of discovery, but a point of connection between what lay hidden and what moved above. Shadow followed immediately, emerging into the open with a smooth, controlled motion, his body relaxing slightly as his paws met the ground, yet his attention remained forward, scanning the clearing with quiet intent. Ethan turned slowly, his eyes adjusting to the wider darkness, and for a moment, there was nothing unusual, just the outline of the cabin, the stillness of the trees, and the distant stretch of sky, filled with silent stars. But then he noticed it, not movement in the usual sense, but a subtle shift in the way the light touched the clearing, as if something had passed through recently, leaving behind a trace too faint to see directly, but strong enough to feel. Shadow stepped forward, nose low to the ground, following a path only he seemed to recognize, moving a few feet before stopping and looking back at Ethan, his gaze steady, expectant, as if inviting him to understand something without needing explanation. Ethan walked toward him, the device in his hand still pulsing quietly, and when he looked down at its screen, he saw that the pattern had changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that whatever it had been tracking was no longer exactly where it had been before. He lifted his eyes again, following Shadow's line of sight out toward the edge of the clearing, where the trees thickened and the darkness deepened, and in that moment, the realization settled in, not sudden, but steady. This was never about finding something that was lost. It was about noticing something that had always been moving, something that could only be seen by those willing to pay attention. He stood there for a long second, the cold air filling his lungs, the quiet of the night wrapping around him. And then he let out a slow breath, the tension he had carried for years easing in a way he had not expected, not because everything was understood, but because it no longer needed to be. Shadow came to stand beside him, close but not touching, his presence steady and certain, and together they faced the dark tree line, not as something to fear, but as something to listen to. Ethan lowered the device slightly, his grip relaxed now, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something settle into place inside him, a quiet alignment between instinct and trust, between past and present. And as the faint rhythm beneath the earth continued, unchanged and patient, he understood that not every answer needed to be uncovered all at once. Some things revealed themselves only to those who stayed, who listened, who chose to follow the quiet signals others walked past without ever hearing. And sometimes, the life you choose to save becomes the one that teaches you how to see again.